Okay, here is part two of uh, Japan going through World War II. We're getting into some upsetting stuff with some upsetting images. Let's move this out of the way here. Hello, and welcome back to me. Let's go to share screen. So we are now getting into the second part, really parts 2 and 3, and that is World War II. All right, let me share this up with y'all. So I'm going to get into Pearl Harbor, the debate over the use of atomic weapons or nuclear weapons in Japan, and then the situation with Japan post-war, with the U.S. occupying the country for about 7 years. One interesting question we sort of asked this question earlier in the year about, is Japan an aggressor or a victim? It's tempting to think of Japan as a victim when we just focus in on the atomic bombs, well, depending on your perspective. But it really raises the question or the thought that in war there are not sort of all good or all bad. It's once you're engaged in war, it's it's highly unlikely that you're going to take the high road and never engage in war crimes and kill innocent people. I mean, that is the nature of war. And so Japan really exemplifies this sense of being both brutal towards others, particularly Chinese and Koreans, but also the subject of tremendous violence by the United States in the firebombing and in the use of nuclear weapons. All right, let's get into it. I had this map up the last time. You can see that part of the resentment and the racism in Japan is fueled by this history of European imperialism in the region, which kind of suggests a sense of inferiority in Japan. Japan wants to kind of show the world that they are not a subject nation, that they are also a powerful nation too. So again, by the 30s, you've got Japan increasingly taking over parts of Asia, including a significant section of China. 1931, as I mentioned last time, Japan will invade Manchuria. They call it Manchukuo. They begin to seek dominance in the region, and they're looking for resources such as coal, iron, rice, military bases, and to physically expand, create more space, and project their power. Okay. The U.S. Begins to put economic sanctions on Japan. You have to understand that the United States and China, until the Communist Revolution in 1949, the United States and China were allies. They were allies in the war. China was a republican form of government, more or less, after 1911. And it's not going to be until 1949, a few years after World War II, that China will be a communist nation. Mind you, the communists and the capitalists were at war in China as a civil war before World War II. Of course, Mao was the leader of the communists, and Chiang Kai-shek was the leader of the capitalists, or the pro-Western forces anyway. And when World War II started, they sort of laid down their arms against each other, unified against Japan. As soon as World War II ended, they went back to war. And it's just a few short years until the communists dominate and put an end to Chiang Kai-shek and his forces, who flee to the island of, let me get my pointer here, flee to the island of Taiwan, called Formosa at the time. So for the Chinese government and for many Chinese people, Taiwan is considered a runaway province. It's still a province of China, but it's not under direct Chinese government. Most countries pretty much see Taiwan as a fully functioning independent country with a pretty strong capitalist economy. American presidents pretty much did not officially proclaim one or the other. Trump changed that when he congratulated the Taiwanese president on his election, essentially stating that he's recognizing Taiwanese independence. And that, of course, angered China, which is one of Trump's favorite things to do. All right. We mentioned the alliance between Japan and the Nazis. They had this collective anti-Soviet agreement in 1936. They build an alliance, military alliance by 1939, and they go to war. All right. So what is Japan's attitude towards the United States, and why did they bomb Pearl Harbor? Let's take a look at that. Again, there were already U.S. troops in China to support China. They were boycotting trade with Japan. Japan did not like that. They needed resources during the war. And the United States began to withhold those, as it was definitely showing its preference for Europe, although technically neutral until they entered the war in 1942. After Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, that was the official entrance of the United States into the war, both Europe and Japan. But the United States was definitely showing a trade and economic preference and political preference for Western Europe. All right. Japan then wanted to weaken the U.S. Pacific Fleet. So it's like this. Basically, their view was, let's provoke the United States into battle by bombing them. But the assumption is that the United States will not want to get into this war, and will make a peace treaty, some sort of peace treaty with Japan, which, well, I just lost my slides, didn't I? One moment here. Where did we go? Let's try that again. Hello. The idea again would be that the United States would then make this treaty with Japan, and that would neutralize the United States in the war. So Japan would do some damage, they'd give something back to the United States, and have agreement that they would not go to war. It's kind of like when the Nazis wanted to eliminate the Soviet Union in World War II, and then they could focus all their attention to the West. Of course, Soviet Union persisted in fighting. And the United States, with Franklin Delano Roosevelt as president, declaring war on Japan the day after, on December 8th, 1941, lost the gamble. Their bet that the United States would look for peace did not happen, and the United States went to war instead. You know that. All right, let's get rid of my pointer here. Japan, by the way, knew they couldn't defeat the United States, so this was, their thinking was that they would kind of bring the United States into conflict and then end that conflict quickly. Pearl Harbor is December 7th, 1941. You'll read a little about that. This is the largest U.S. naval base. There's a bunch of aircraft there. Everything's kind of jammed close together, so they were easy targets for a surprise attack by Japan. That kind of surprise attack, of course, could not happen today. Several ships were damaged. 161 planes were destroyed. Another 100 were damaged. So they did some significant damage there. And more Americans were killed there than at 9/11 by a couple hundred, I believe. I don't remember the exact number, but 2,300 Americans were killed there. And another 1,000 plus were wounded. Here's a little map of Pearl Harbor. You can see red here, getting my pointer again, are ships that were sunk, orange that were heavily damaged, yellow that were moderately damaged. So again, you can see things were kind of really crammed together here at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, which was, again, our Americans' largest naval base. All right, the very next day, President Roosevelt declared that this would be, December 7th would be a day that would live in infamy. It's sort of the 9/11 at the time, and declares war. And Douglas MacArthur, General MacArthur, was named the Allied commander then for the Pacific. Japan is very successful in the beginning of the war, holding back the Americans. But things begin to turn around at Midway Island, which is an island out in the Pacific. And this is very brutal fighting, such as at Guadalcanal, another island, perhaps the most brutal. A lot of hand-to-hand combat, tens of thousands. These are small islands. Tens of thousands of Japanese are dying there. And this is when the United States begins to gain the upper hand. The question is, can they actually conquer the island, the nation of Japan, the islands that comprise Japan, as opposed to these other colonial possessions of Japan. So I'd said 100, but I should have said 60. The United States begins to firebomb, just like they did with Britain in Germany. They begin to drop incendiary bombs. These are bombs designed to light things on fire. Well, Japan's housing stock is largely wooden. They burn from the air. They drop bombs that burn 16 square miles of Tokyo, the capital. There are actually more deaths from the firebombing than there are from the atomic bombs, which indicates how many people the Americans killed there. These are, of course, considered war crimes, the intentional targeting of civilians, massive numbers of civilians. The United States had been developing atomic weapons, and the question was, can they win a war against Japan? Japan insisted, no matter how much they were losing, that they would not surrender. It was remember the Bushido Code, the code of loyalty and honor, essentially restricted Japan from the idea of surrender. In fact, going back to the Nanjing massacre, part of some people argue that the reason Japan was so brutal against the population in Nanjing is because soldiers there, perhaps prematurely, soldiers there had surrendered quickly, and they saw that as pathetic, and in fact, deserving of brutality. So Japan would no way surrender in this war. And increasingly, the United States had to ask, well, how are we going to get Japan to surrender? We have to bring it to its knees. And they begin to bomb civilians in large numbers, as I mentioned. Increasingly, they had to ask, well, what would it take? Would it take dropping these massive atomic weapons? So that is one argument. The Manhattan Project had been developing weapons out in the southwestern desert. You saw in our Cuba segment the testing, the Trinity test. So these tests going on, these are secret. Not many people really knew about them. Skip that. And you'll look at, you have some, I gave you a lot of extra here right now that I'm thinking about it. You'll read a little bit about the pros and the cons of dropping this bomb. Just keep in mind a couple of things that you might say that it was necessary to win the war, but question the morality of it. Alternatively, you might say morally, the United States had the right to drop these bombs, although it wasn't necessary to win the war. So there's evidence that Japan was moving towards surrender. It was an internal debate. The hardcore element surrounding the emperor said, no way, never. Others were like, they're killing us here. We will never be able to ultimately win. They are more powerful than us. So there's evidence that they were moving towards it. There's some conjecture that the United States dropped the bomb, not just to bring Japan to its knees, but to project its power to the Soviet Union, which, it knew it was going to essentially be at war at the day that the World War II ended. So there are other reasons why the United States may have used these bombs. The second bomb on Nagasaki, just a few days later, many people argue was like, okay, I can see on the first one, but give them a few more days to surrender before dropping a second atomic bomb. The first on Hiroshima was more lethal, killed more people, but in any case. So there's arguments on both sides there. You'll see some video footage if you look at some of the resources I gave you. The destruction is, mind-bending. The blast was so powerful and strong that it actually left permanent shadows in the cement. So there's a famous bridge, for example, and the bomb blast left shadows from the bridge railing on the cement of the bridge. It left shadows of people who were vaporized in the cement as well. It's, kind of a hard, again, thing to understand, comprehend, I should say, what it was like to experience that. People who survived but were near the blast site suffered from immense radiation poisoning. Tens of thousands are going to die in the days and months after, the year after or so. They're going to pass on some radiation to the next generation. So very destructive, very destructive. There are firestorms that begin to build from all these fires around the city, killing even more people beyond the blast center. I mentioned radiation and birth defects. Within 5 years, 200,000 people are said to have died as a result of these bombs. As a result of the bomb of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is again 3 or 4 days later. You can see pictures. This is one of the largest cities in the world in 1945. And this is what it looks like at its city center. Just vaporized, evaporated, disappeared. There you can see those shadows on that bridge I mentioned. Japan will ultimately surrender. Again, some will argue that they would have anyway, and that certainly the second, if not the first bomb, was not necessary. And some say this saved lives. Because if we didn't drop these bombs, they said, we would have to invade Japan directly. And that would lead to the deaths of tens of thousands of Americans. If not, even some people even said even more Japanese would have died from a direct invasion. So there are some people that argue that the morality is clear, that the atomic bombs actually saved lives. You'll have to get into the evidence to make your decision on that. Blah, blah, blah. This is kind of a rehash here. Let's take a look at post-war. Your last resource, we'll look at the American Constitution for Japan. Let me just go through this. You can read through these notes. Okay. So here is an image aboard a U.S. battleship when the Japanese leadership had boarded it to make their official surrender, which, of course, is a massive act of shame given the ultra-nationalist political culture at the time. I actually prefer to call it the political culture versus the culture of Japan. It's the norms and behaviors and beliefs of the political system that change, right, over time. General MacArthur's goal in post-war U.S. occupation was to make Japan, like Germany, a prosperous capitalist economy. The thinking, again, was that with a large middle class, with a prosperous population, people are not upset, they're not frustrated, they're not resentful, and they buy in to a peace-loving country, all right? A democratic one. So MacArthur wanted to make Japan more democratic, with the belief that democracies are much more favorable towards peace. He insisted Japan have a constitution, much of it influenced by the United States. Those are sort of the two main things. And you can see in that constitution and that 7-year occupation, there's sort of 3 main areas of impact. One is on the political. So Japan is allowed to keep its emperor. Of course, for the Americans, the symbol of the emperor was sort of fascist, racist, war-loving Japan. They were allowed to keep that emperor as a symbol, and that was a good decision because for many Japanese, they didn't want to. It would have made them feel like their culture had been stripped from them as well. So the emperor, being a traditional symbol of traditional Japanese culture, was allowed to remain, although with much less power. More power given to the people. Japan had demilitarized entirely, so they have still to this day, have no standing army. There's been talk for some years now of that changing. They can elect their representatives. Women have the right to vote in the economic realm. The large landowners had to reduce their land holdings. They broke up these business monopolies, the zaibatsu, and rather than them running like feudal lords, but in business or aristocratic class, Japan was transformed much more into a capitalist economy, a free market. Unions were legalized, workers had a say, and then the Constitution legalized free speech, except for criticism of the United States was not allowed. They eliminated this moral training or ultra patriotism in the school that kind of was emperor worship and ultra nationalism. That was stripped from curriculum, and the media became more open. So that's what I have to say about that. email me with questions. I hope you're all well, and take care. I'm going to see if I can do this better this time. There we go.